Curious about what people ate during America's hardest times? When the Great Depression struck in 1929, families across the country had to stretch every dollar and make the most of every ingredient. Churches and community groups became essential hubs for swapping recipes that could help everyone get by. Feeding many on a limited budget, these dishes weren't just about getting by, they became comfort foods passed down through generations. Let's explore 25 amazing church recipes from the Great Depression era that are still worth making today. These dishes blend simplicity, affordability, and surprisingly delicious flavors that have stood the test of time. Poor man's steak. This dish emerged as a clever alternative when beef was out of reach for many families. It takes simple ground beef, stretches it with cracker crumbs or oatmeal, and shapes it into. Community suppers and potlucks were a staple, and the First Baptist Church of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, featured a version in their 1933 community cookbook that became widely popular. What made Poor Man's Steak so practical was its ability to feed a family of 6 with just a pound of ground beef, truly. A budget miracle during tough times, typically served with mashed potatoes to soak up the gravy, this dish perfectly captured the Depression-era mindset of making simple ingredients taste extraordinary. Today, it remains a classic comfort food, reminding us of the resourcefulness that defined that generation. Potato soup. Potato soup stands as one of the most iconic dishes from the Great Depression era, shared in church communities across America. This hearty staple was made with the most affordable vegetable, the humble potato. The basic recipe called for just potatoes, onions, water, milk, or sometimes the only thing on the table was the water the potatoes had been boiled in, flavored with a bit of butter, if they had any, and a dash of salt and pepper. At church gatherings, especially during the monthly community meals where every penny had to stretch, large pots of potato soup were a staple, often prepared by the Methodist Women's Auxiliary. Back in rural Minnesota, a recipe published in 1932 quickly made its way into countless kitchens, proudly claiming that a single pot of potato soup could fill the bellies of 12 hungry souls for under $1. The true brilliance of Depression-era potato soup lay in its adaptability. Families simply tossed in whatever leftovers they had on hand. Ham bones were used to add flavor, wild onions could be gathered from the fields, and even potato peels found their way into the pot to boost nutrition. When milk was scarce, some cooks would sprinkle in a bit of flour to thicken the soup. Even today, potato soup stands as a heartwarming reminder that even the simplest ingredients can come together to create something truly special. Modern versions of potato soup now include cheese, bacon, or herbs, luxuries that were rare during the Depression. Another surprising creation from that time was water pie, a dessert made mostly from water. It seemed impossible, yet it became a staple at church bake sales during those hard years. During the Depression, milk, fruits, and nuts were luxuries few could afford. The recipe for water pie originated in Southern church communities, with one of the earliest known versions appearing in the First Presbyterian Church of Memphis's 1931 fundraising cookbook. The pie relied on simple, affordable ingredients. A simple pastry crust was filled with water, sugar, flour, butter, and vanilla extract. When baked, these ingredients transformed into a custard-like filling with a delicate sweetness. Water pie was often featured at church gatherings, as it could be made in large batches with minimal cost. One minister's wife from Oklahoma became known for bringing 6 water pies to every church function, feeding dozens for just pennies a slice. The pie's subtle sweetness and surprising texture delighted Depression-era diners, who had little access to fancy desserts. Today, it remains a nostalgic favorite. Water pie enjoys occasional revivals as people rediscover this remarkable example of creativity born from necessity. Dandelion salad is another Depression-era dish, reflecting the practice of foraging for free food. Church communities taught members to identify edible wild plants, making the most of nature's offerings. Dandelions, among the most accessible and nutritious options, could be found in nearly every yard and field. In 1934, the Lutheran Ladies' Aid Society in Pennsylvania Dutch country published a widely shared recipe, advising members to gather young dandelion greens before the plants matured. The greens were gathered before the flowers bloomed, ensuring they were tender and less bitter. Typically, they were dressed with a warm bacon dressing made from bacon drippings, vinegar, sugar, and sometimes a hard-boiled egg. Church picnics in spring often featured dandelion salad as a fresh treat after winter's limited options. Gathering dandelions became a community effort, with children sent to collect the greens while learning about nature's bounty. Rich in vitamins A and C, dandelion greens offered essential nutrition during a time when fresh food was scarce. Fresh produce was a luxury many couldn't afford, but modern nutritionists have rediscovered what Depression-era families knew by necessity. Dandelions are incredibly nutritious superfoods that grow abundantly for free. Vinegar pie emerged as a creative solution when fruit for pies was scarce or too expensive. This clever dessert uses vinegar to create a tangy flavor similar to lemon, forming a simple custard pie with ingredients most households already had. The First Methodist Church of Springfield, Illinois, included a beloved vinegar pie recipe in their community cookbook. A 1930 community cookbook described vinegar pie as the perfect dessert for when the apple barrel was empty. The standard recipe combined sugar, eggs, a splash of vinegar, usually apple cider, butter, and warm spices like cinnamon or nutmeg, all in a single pie crust. Church socials often featured vinegar pies, especially in winter and early spring when fresh fruit was scarce. Women's auxiliary groups prepared these pies for fundraisers, recognizing how inexpensive ingredients could be transformed into a dessert that sold for much-needed profits. The pie's practicality came from its shelf stability. Without fruit that could spoil, these pies could be made ahead of time for church gatherings. The subtle tanginess, paired with warm spices, created a comforting dessert that satisfied sweet cravings during the hardest economic times. Hoover stew earned its ironic name from President Herbert Hoover, who was widely blamed for the Depression. This one-pot meal became a staple at church soup kitchens across America, feeding countless families through community outreach programs. The Salvation Army developed one of the most popular versions around 1932, creating a flexible recipe that could feed large numbers inexpensively. The basic recipe combined hot dogs, sliced to stretch further, macaroni, canned tomatoes, and whatever vegetables were on hand, often just onions and maybe canned corn. Church soup kitchens prepared enormous batches of Hoover stew, with some records showing pots that fed over 300 people in a single serving. The First Baptist Church of Detroit famously served Hoover stew twice a week throughout 1933, providing over 15,000 meals to those in need. Hoover stew became a lifesaver for unemployed workers and their families. Its simplicity allowed for endless adaptations depending on the donations received. Beans could replace some of the hot dogs, different pasta shapes could be used, and any vegetable was welcome. This humble stew highlights the critical role churches played in feeding America during its darkest economic hours. Wacky cake, also known as crazy cake or depression cake, solved the challenge of making dessert without eggs, milk, or butter, all ingredients that were expensive or hard to find during the Depression. This clever chocolate cake became a staple at church bake sales and celebrations. The Women's Auxiliary of Grace Episcopal Church in Cleveland published one of the first documented recipes in their 1933 fundraising cookbook. The cake uses vinegar and baking soda for leavening, vegetable oil instead of butter, and cocoa powder for chocolate flavor. A distinct feature of Wacky cake is that the ingredients are mixed directly in the baking pan, creating fewer dishes to wash, an important consideration when soap was a luxury. Church functions often featured Wacky cake because it could be made quickly, inexpensively, and in large quantities. Sunday school teachers frequently prepared it for children's events, as it was both economical and reliably delicious. Despite its simple ingredients, the cake's moist texture and rich chocolate flavor defied its humble origins, proving that delicious treats were possible even in the hardest times. Modern bakers still appreciate Wacky cake for its vegan-friendly ingredients and foolproof preparation. Ham and bean soup epitomized the Depression-era philosophy of stretching a small amount of meat to feed many. Churches across America embraced this hearty, economical soup for community meals and food relief programs. The Ladies' Aid Society of the First Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri, published a notable recipe in their 1931 community cookbook, explaining how a single ham bone with a little meat could be transformed into a nourishing meal. Still clinging to flavor, a single ham bone could provide enough soup to serve 20 hungry souls. The soup combined dried beans, usually navy or Great Northern, a ham bone or small pieces of ham, onions, and sometimes carrots or potatoes, if available. Church basement kitchens often had huge pots of this simmering during the winter months, ready to serve anyone in need. The long cooking time softened the beans and extracted every bit of flavor from the ham bone, creating a rich, satisfying meal with minimal ingredients. What made this soup particularly practical was its use of dried beans, an affordable, shelf-stable protein that could be stored indefinitely. The tradition of serving ham and bean soup continued in many churches long after the Depression, becoming part of the American comfort food canon. Peanut butter bread offered a protein-rich alternative to traditional bread when eggs and milk were scarce. This dense, satisfying bread became popular in church communities where feeding children nutritious food on a limited budget was a constant challenge. The recipe first appeared in the 1932 Five Roses Flour Cookbook, but quickly spread through church recipe exchanges. The First Presbyterian Women's Circle of Des Moines adapted a version of peanut butter bread that became widely shared, noting it was especially good for filling growing children's lunch pails. The simple recipe required just flour, baking powder, salt, sugar, milk, or water during the toughest times, and peanut butter, creating a hearty bread without yeast, eggs, or butter. Church bake sales often featured peanut butter bread, and it was frequently included in food baskets distributed to families in need. Its protein content from peanut butter made it especially valuable, providing essential nutrition when meat was unaffordable for many families. The dense texture and slightly sweet, nutty flavor made it popular with children, ensuring they'd eat this economical food without complaint. Church supper casserole became the ultimate solution for feeding large groups with minimal ingredients during the Depression. This adaptable dish graced countless church fellowship halls across America, bringing communities together despite economic hardship. The Women's Missionary Union of the First Baptist Church in Oklahoma City created a version in 1934 that spread widely throughout Southern Baptist churches. Their original recipe combined cooked macaroni, canned tomatoes, and whatever protein was available. Often just a small amount of ground meat stretched with breadcrumbs or, occasionally, just beans. What made church supper casserole particularly brilliant was its flexibility. It could incorporate nearly any vegetables, starches, or small amounts of meat available. The dish was typically topped with breadcrumbs mixed with a bit of saved bacon grease for flavor, then baked until bubbling and browned. If you're enjoying these Depression-era recipes and want to help us continue bringing this forgotten history to life, please consider supporting us on Patreon. The link is in the description below. Your membership helps us research and preserve these culinary traditions that tell the story of American resilience. Church communities relied on these casseroles for monthly potlucks and community outreach, with some congregations serving weekly meals throughout the Depression years. The tradition of church casseroles, born out of necessity, continues today, though modern versions typically feature more abundant ingredients. Egg drop soup offered a protein-rich meal option when eggs were one of the few affordable proteins, especially for rural church communities where many families had limited access to other sources of nutrition. Even during the hardest times, many families kept chickens. The Women's Guild of St. Mary's Catholic Church in Chicago's ethnic neighborhoods adapted this simple soup from Chinese traditions, creating a version that used minimal ingredients, just chicken broth, often made from bones or scraps, eggs, and sometimes a sprinkle of green onions or a bit of cornstarch for thickening. Church cooking demonstrations often featured egg drop soup as a way to teach economical cooking methods to struggling families. One parish priest in Philadelphia reportedly said, "With this soup, a family of 4 can have protein for pennies a day." The simple preparation involved slowly pouring beaten eggs into simmering broth, creating delicate ribbons of cooked egg. This technique turned a few eggs and basic broth into a satisfying, protein-rich soup that could serve as a complete meal with just a piece of bread on the side. Tomato soup cake might sound strange to modern ears, but it was a stroke of genius during the Depression, when fresh fruit for cakes was unaffordable. This spice cake used canned tomato soup to provide moisture, acidity, and a subtle flavor, replacing more expensive ingredients. The Methodist Women's Circle of Lansing, Michigan, published a popular version of tomato soup cake in their 1936 community cookbook, claiming that the secret ingredient was undetectable. The cake combines a can of tomato soup with flour, sugar, lard or oil, spices like cinnamon and cloves, and baking soda, creating a moist spice cake reminiscent of modern carrot cake but without the costly additions. Church bake sales often featured tomato soup cake, sometimes topped with cream cheese frosting when ingredients allowed or simply dusted with saved sugar. The recipe became especially popular because Campbell's soup was affordable and shelf-stable, making it easy for households to keep the ingredients on hand for special occasions. The cake's spiced flavor profile hid its unusual origin, making it a hit even with children who might otherwise resist vegetable-based desserts. This clever substitution highlights the remarkable culinary creativity born from necessity during the Depression. Creamed chipped beef on toast, affectionately known by less polite names among military personnel. Creamed chipped beef on toast, a budget-friendly protein dish, was a staple at church breakfasts and suppers during the Depression. The Lutheran Society of Milwaukee included a detailed recipe in their 1934 community cookbook, praising it as a satisfying meal for hungry families. The dish combines dried beef, rehydrated and rinsed to reduce saltiness, with a simple white sauce made from flour, fat, and milk, all served over toast made from homemade bread. Church kitchens would prepare large trays of this dish for men's prayer breakfasts and evening meals for working families. Its appeal lay in how a small amount of dried beef, shelf-stable and more affordable than fresh meat, could be stretched to feed many when combined with a creamy sauce. Rural churches, in particular, embraced this recipe as many farm families had access to milk, even during hard times. The dish remains in American culinary memory as an example of making the most of limited resources and creating a satisfying meal from just a few basic ingredients. Corn chowder became a staple of church. Corn chowder became a staple of church suppers during the Depression, especially in rural communities where homegrown corn could be preserved for winter use. This hearty soup stretched minimal ingredients to feed many hungry people. The Women's Fellowship of the Congregational Church in rural Iowa published a respected recipe in 1933, emphasizing that a little salt pork and some corn could warm both body and spirit during winter's darkest days. Their version combined fresh, canned, or rehydrated dried corn, potatoes, onions, and a small amount of salt pork for flavor, all simmered in water and sometimes finished with a splash of milk when available. Monthly church suppers frequently featured huge pots of corn chowder as the main course, often accompanied by simple biscuits or cornbread. The soup's appeal lay in its ability to create a filling meal primarily from vegetables that many rural families could grow themselves. What made corn chowder particularly valuable during the Depression was its adaptability. When milk was scarce, the soup could be made with just water, and when meat was unavailable, the salt pork could be omitted entirely. This flexible, satisfying soup embodied the resourcefulness of the era. Bread pudding became a symbol of the waste not, want not mentality during the Depression, turning stale bread, an item that no family could afford to waste, into a comforting and nourishing dessert. Church communities across the country embraced this thrifty treat for both everyday family meals and larger gatherings. The Episcopal Church Women of Christ Church in Alexandria, Virginia, shared a well-loved recipe in their 1932 community cookbook, referring to bread pudding as alchemy that turns yesterday's bread into today's comfort. Their recipe involved soaking stale bread in a mixture of milk, sugar, eggs, when available, applesauce, when not, cinnamon, and, if affordable, raisins. Church events often featured large trays of bread pudding, particularly after communion services when leftover bread had to be repurposed. Its flexibility allowed it to be made in advance and served either warm or cold, making it an ideal dish for community events with limited cooking facilities. During the Depression, bread pudding also played a crucial role in reducing food waste, as even hard, stale bread could be softened and transformed into something delicious. Many families received day-old bread from church relief programs, and bread pudding turned this charity into a comforting treat, offering solace in tough times and making the most out of limited resources. Chowchow, a mixed vegetable pickle, became a staple during the Depression, making use of whatever garden produce was available and preserving the summer's bounty for the leaner months. The Baptist Women's Missionary Union chapters across the South popularized various versions, with a notable recipe appearing in the 1935 community cookbook from the First Baptist Church of Charlotte, North Carolina. Their version combined cabbage, green tomatoes, onions, peppers, and cucumbers in a vinegar-based pickling solution with mustard seeds and turmeric. Church canning circles would gather when gardens were at their peak to prepare large batches of chowchow, often using the church kitchen facilities with larger canning setups. These community canning days served both practical and social purposes, allowing women to share labor and equipment while preserving food for their families and church food relief programs. Chowchow was particularly valuable during the Depression because it could add both interest and nutrition to otherwise plain dishes. A spoonful could elevate a plate of beans, enhance a sandwich with sparse fillings, or make a simple cornbread feel like a more complete meal. Cabbage with hot bacon dressing turned an affordable vegetable into a satisfying side dish. Church communities, especially in German Lutheran areas of Pennsylvania and the Midwest, valued this recipe for transforming humble cabbage into a special treat. Cabbage with hot bacon dressing was particularly embraced by church communities during the Depression, with St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Fort Wayne publishing a version in their 1933 recipe collection. Their recipe involved wilting shredded cabbage with a dressing made from a small amount of bacon, or just the saved drippings, vinegar, sugar, and sometimes a beaten egg for richness. Church suppers often featured this dish in the fall and winter when cabbage was one of the few affordable fresh vegetables available. The preparation was typically done right before serving, with the hot dressing poured over the raw cabbage to wilt it slightly while still maintaining some crispness. What made this dish especially practical during the Depression was cabbage's affordability, long storage life, and high vitamin content. The small amount of bacon or bacon drippings added flavor without requiring much of this relatively expensive ingredient, embodying the Depression-era philosophy of making a little go a long way. Milk toast represented perhaps the simplest comfort food of the Depression, providing warm nourishment when little else was available. Church communities often recommended this basic dish for feeding the sick, elderly, and very young when resources were scarce. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, active in many churches, published a recipe in their 1931 household guide, noting that milk toast sustains both body and spirit when nothing else can be afforded. The recipe for milk toast involved toasting homemade bread and lightly buttering it, if possible, then pouring warm milk over it. Sometimes, it was seasoned with a sprinkle of salt, sugar, or cinnamon. Church visiting committees often prepared milk toast for shut-ins and ill congregation members, as it required minimal cooking facilities and ingredients that most households could manage, even in dire circumstances. For families with a cow, milk toast became a way to create a complete meal centered around this nutritious staple. What made milk toast particularly valuable during the Depression was its ease of digestion and basic nutritional value, providing protein, carbohydrates, and calcium in a simple form. This humble dish symbolizes how Depression-era cooks found ways to offer comfort with the barest of ingredients. Potato pancakes turned the humble potato, often the most affordable food available, into a satisfying meal. Church communities across various ethnic traditions shared their versions of this versatile dish. The Ladies' Aid Society of St. John's Lutheran Church in Wisconsin published a German-inspired recipe in 1934, explaining that 3 potatoes could feed 4 people when prepared this way. Their recipe grated raw potatoes and mixed them with a small amount of flour, an egg if available, or sometimes just enough water to bind the ingredients together. Water, if eggs were unavailable, and onions were added to the grated potato mixture, then fried in small amounts of saved fat until crispy. Church community meals often featured potato pancakes, especially in ethnic communities with Eastern European or German heritage. The dish was particularly popular for Friday meals in Catholic parishes observing meatless days, providing a filling alternative to more expensive fish. What made potato pancakes especially valuable during the Depression was their ability to be a complete meal with just one main ingredient, served with applesauce or sour cream if available, but satisfying even on their own. The crispy texture and savory flavor made this economical dish feel like more than just another way to eat the ubiquitous potato. Mock apple pie stands as perhaps the most ingenious culinary deception of the Depression era, creating a dessert that tastes remarkably like apple pie without using a single apple. This creative substitution gained popularity when fruit was prohibitively expensive for most families. The recipe spread widely through church cookbook exchanges, with the Presbyterian Women's Circle of Topeka, Kansas, publishing a version in 1932 that claimed, "None will guess the secret ingredient." The pie fills a standard crust with Ritz crackers or similar crackers, soaked in a syrup of sugar, water, cream of tartar, and lemon juice, which miraculously takes on an apple-like flavor and texture when baked. Church bake sales often featured mock apple pies, sometimes not revealing their cracker base, making them a delightful surprise when the secret was uncovered. The recipe became so popular that Ritz Crackers began printing it on their packaging in 1934, although church communities had been sharing versions long before the commercial adoption. What made mock apple pie particularly remarkable was how it addressed not just economic necessity but also the psychological need for normalcy and small pleasures during hard times. The ability to serve apple pie, an iconic American dessert, when real apples were unattainable provided both physical and emotional nourishment. Bean patties offered an ingenious meat substitute during the Depression, creating satisfying, protein-rich burgers from inexpensive dried beans. Church communities championed these economical alternatives at a time when meat was beyond many families' budgets. The Missionary Society of the First Methodist Church in Chicago published a frequently reproduced recipe in their 1933 economy cookbook, noting that these patties satisfied the desire for meat at a fraction of the cost. Their version mashed cooked navy beans with a small amount of onion, breadcrumbs, and seasonings, then formed the mixture into patties and fried them until crisp. Church community kitchens would prepare large batches of bean patties for congregation meals, particularly in working-class parishes where meat had become a rare luxury. The patties were typically served with simple gravy or tomato sauce to add moisture and flavor. What made bean patties particularly important during the Depression was their high protein content and satisfying texture at a time when nutritional deficiencies were a serious concern. These humble patties represent creativity born of necessity, providing nourishment when conventional options were unavailable. Cornmeal mush served as both breakfast and dinner for many families during the Depression, with church relief programs often distributing cornmeal as a staple food item. This simple porridge could be adapted for any meal of the day at minimal cost. A rural Methodist circuit rider who traveled between small country churches distributed a recipe card in 1932 describing cornmeal mush as the cornmeal mush was considered the staff of life when wheat bread was unaffordable. The basic recipe involved simmering cornmeal in water with a pinch of salt until thick, creating a simple porridge. This could be eaten hot with milk and sugar for breakfast, or cooled, sliced, and fried for dinner. Church food relief programs often held demonstrations on how to prepare cornmeal mush in various ways to keep families from growing weary of it. Its versatility was key: sweet for breakfast, savory with beans or greens for dinner, or fried with a bit of onion for a more substantial meal. What made cornmeal mush especially vital during the Depression was its extreme economy. A few cents worth of cornmeal could feed a family for several meals. This humble dish sustained countless Americans through the hardest years of economic collapse, with church communities providing both the ingredients and the knowledge on how to prepare it in different ways. Pinto beans and cornbread became the Depression-era equivalent of fast food, inexpensive, filling, and quick to prepare. Church communities in the South and Southwest elevated this simple pairing into an art form, creating satisfying meals from minimal ingredients. The Baptist Women's Missionary Union of Oklahoma published a widely circulated recipe collection in 1934 that included detailed instructions for this staple meal, noting that a pot of beans and a pan of cornbread could feed a family for just pennies a day. Their approach simmered pinto beans slowly with just salt and perhaps a piece of salt pork if available, while the cornbread required only cornmeal, salt, water, and a small amount of lard or bacon drippings. Church fellowship halls across the country frequently served this simple meal at community gatherings, showcasing its practicality and enduring appeal. Onion sandwiches exemplify the creative resourcefulness that defined Depression-era cooking, using one of the most inexpensive vegetables to create a simple yet satisfying meal. Often featured in church community cookbooks, these sandwiches became a staple for lunchboxes and quick meals when more traditional fillings like meat or cheese were out of reach. The United Methodist Women of rural Georgia included a popular recipe for onion sandwiches in their 1932 pamphlet Feeding Families in Hard Times. This recipe called for slicing sweet onions thinly and soaking them in cold water to mellow their sharpness. The softened onions were then placed between slices of buttered bread, seasoned with salt and pepper. For families with limited resources, butter could be replaced with lard or drippings, making it an adaptable and affordable option. These humble sandwiches were frequently served at church picnics, particularly in early spring when stored onions were one of the few vegetables still available, and fresh spring onions were just beginning to appear. In some communities, children were encouraged to forage for wild greens, like chickweed, to add to the sandwiches, further enhancing their nutritional value and flavor. What made onion sandwiches so valuable during the Depression was their ability to provide both substance and flavor at a minimal cost. The onions, though inexpensive, brought a sharp, satisfying taste, while the bread offered a filling base. In an era when meat and dairy were unaffordable for many, onion sandwiches allowed families to make do with what was on hand, offering both nourishment and a sense of comfort during challenging times. Mayonnaise cake was a brilliant solution to the challenge of making a moist, tender chocolate cake without eggs or butter. By using mayonnaise, which contains both eggs and oil, this clever substitution allowed for a rich cake with minimal ingredients. Church bake sales throughout the Depression era featured this resourceful dessert, with the First Christian Church Women's Circle of Des Moines publishing a popular version in their 1935 fundraising cookbook. They called it Miracle Cake, noting that no one would believe it started with mayonnaise. The recipe combined flour, sugar, cocoa powder, water, and mayonnaise to create a surprisingly rich chocolate cake, without requiring costly dairy ingredients. Church gatherings often included mayonnaise cake for special occasions and celebrations, providing a sweet treat even when traditional baking supplies were hard to come by. Sunday school teachers, in particular, favored this recipe for children's events because it produced a delicious cake every time, despite its unusual base. What made mayonnaise cake especially valuable during the Depression was its ability to transform a common sandwich spread into a dessert, creating something special from everyday items. This cake is a perfect example of the ingenuity that arose when traditional baking methods were no longer feasible due to economic hardship. These 25 Great Depression church recipes are not just historical curiosities. They serve as powerful reminders of human creativity and the support of community during America's darkest economic period. Church kitchens became spaces where necessity sparked innovation, turning the humblest ingredients into nourishing meals that fed both body and spirit. These recipes are more than just a glimpse into the past. They tell stories of resourcefulness, of stretching pennies and ingredients to feed families and communities. They remind us that great food doesn't always need expensive ingredients or complicated techniques. Sometimes, the simplest dishes provide the most comfort. Many of these Depression-era recipes deserve a place in our modern kitchens, not just as historical curiosities, but as practical, delicious, and economical options. They connect us to the resilience of previous generations, and in today's world, they're especially relevant as we look for ways to reduce food waste, cook more affordably, and find comfort in uncertain times. Did this journey through Depression-era church kitchens spark your curiosity for more food history? If you enjoyed exploring these resourceful recipes, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into America's culinary past. Until next time, happy cooking!